record, right?
Yes.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. We are just getting set up and we'll get started in a minute or two. And Fallon, if you'll please help us to monitor the chat on Zoom, and Cheryl, if you can monitor the chat on Facebook in case we have any questions come up there.
Got it.
Thank you. Okay, everybody ready? Amber, is it okay? Is Amber kind of? I guess I'll start.
Facebook is still fetching.
I think it started recording yet. Get excited. How's the live stream look, Alexis?
I am looking at it.
Hi, everybody. We are also going to be live streaming on Facebook, so we're just trying to make sure that that's set up before we get too far into the presentation. So thank you for your patience. If you have not already liked us on Facebook, check for Durham Community Engagement. That's where you can find us.
Ready to go, Laura?
Okay, everybody ready? Good. Hi, everybody. I am Laura Biediger here for our third installment of our community stories. Today we are featuring Braggtown, and I enjoy all of these, but I'm really excited about this one. I was thinking this morning, I've known Vannessa for probably at least 3 or 3.5 years now, and learning more about her community every time we talk. So I'm excited for her to have a chance to share this with so many people, and to hear from the other people on the call as well. So just a reminder, we are recording. So we will post this on the city's YouTube page. You can also find our previous versions of the series on the city's YouTube page. That's City of Durham. If you have questions, you can ask them in the chat, or if you are watching this via Facebook live stream, you can also ask them on Facebook. If you're on Zoom, there's also a feature for Q&A if you would like to ask your questions there. It makes it a little easier for us to keep track of them. And we will try to answer as many of those as we can at the end of today's session. Just a reminder, we're all learning. This is history. We weren't all alive 100 or 200 years ago, so we don't all get it completely right. And there isn't, exact documentation for everything. So if we get something wrong in here, or you've heard a different side of the story, that's okay. Let us know, because there's always so many perspectives. And as always, thank you for being kind, respectful, and patient. Just a reminder, this work with our community stories today is a part of the city's equitable community engagement work. This is about making sure that the people in Durham who are affected by the city's programs and policies are really engaged in that work. And a piece of this is making sure that we know about the history of our community, especially as it relates to government impacts. But we also that we view each community more than it is today and understand the longer story of how it came to be. So that's why we're here today, to learn more about Braggtown. So with that, I will turn it over to Vannessa Mason Evans to introduce her three fellow panelists.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to first thank the City of Durham for inviting the Braggtown Community Association as well as our residents into this space. And we hope you enjoy the history of Braggtown. On the call, my panelists are Constance Wright, which is my Vice President of the Braggtown Community Association. We have Ricky Hart, who is a descendant of the Stagville Plantation, and we have Jory Hart, which is also a descendant of the Stagville Plantation. And I am the chair of the Braggtown Community Association and a longtime resident of Braggtown. I'll turn it over to Ricky.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ricky L. Hart. I'm a descendant of Stagville. My father's name was Brody Hart. His father before him was Willis Hart, and his father from before him is Ephraim Hart. And we go all the way back to 1790, descendants of Stagville. And we were living in what they call slave quarters number 13. To give you some history back on Stagville, it was 33,000 acres, which is approximately 51 square miles. So if you stuck a pin in Stagville right there at the home place and go out 51 miles and made us a conference, that's how big Stagville was. So back then, if a slave was to try to escape, it would take him days, if not weeks, to get off of the plantation, to get off of 51 square miles. They had over 1,000 slaves there. Also, just to give you some background, Mr. Cameron had plantations in Greene County, Alabama, and Tunica County, Mississippi. So even with that, just trying to keep things short, there were some core families on Stagville. And I'm going to go through just a few of them. I know Vannessa has more, but some of the core families, the Hart family, the Justice family, the Peaks, Suits, and the Whitteds. The other families were the Camerons, the Edwards, the Harrises, the Haskins, the Holmens, the Jones, the Moores, the Sowells, the Umsteads, and the Vessies, but there's many more. Stagville is divided up into 5 sections. One was the main section of Stagville, the main house. Then you had the Eno section, the Little River section, Snow Hill, and Horton Grove. There were 3 rivers running through the plantation: the Eno River, the Little River, and the Flat River. Also, as time went on, there was, I think, 3 schools at that time that was at Stagville. One was the Stagville Colored School, the Wood School, and Mill Grove. Also on there was the church, which was Cameron Grove Baptist Church. Now, the way it got its name is that the descendants wanted a church, and the master, who was at that time Benningham Cameron, he gave them the land, he gave them supplies. The only thing was you had to name the church after him. So that's where they get the name of Cameron Grove Baptist Church, okay? And it was there, and then in 1952, they moved the church from the plantation over to where it is now on Berwyn Avenue, where it still sits today. And when you come in through the vestibule, the first part, if you look up in part of the church, you will see where they bought some of the wood from the old church to the church where it is now. So also in that area, there's a grave site that's unmarked. And there's over 1,000 graves at that grave site in that area of slaves and descendants in that area, reference to that unmarked grave site. And I know some people would look and they were like, well, where is it? It's there, but it's unmarked. We used to Cameron Grove, that we used to go over there during the fall with Mr. Justice and go over there and clean it up. So, and that hasn't been done for many years. But again, with Stagville, the history is deep. There's a lot of stories that come out of Stagville from many families. And if people would look, they see that there's a lot of families that moved from Stagville, some of them, but moved a couple of miles down the road and went to Braggtown and resettled in Braggtown. And you will find a lot of those families, and I'm sure Vannessa will be able to touch on that later, but a lot of those families that moved from the plantation that moved into Braggtown and other parts of Durham. And also you have a lot of families intermarrying. So you have a lot of people, when you see them and you ask them, as the old people would say, who is your daddy? Who is your granddaddy? Who is your grandmother? And they would go back and they would trace, because they would know whose family was who and who is your grandparents and your cousins, your uncles. And that's, how people would know what family you were with. So with that said, I mean, there's a lot that goes on that went on at Cameron Grove. And even though with the papers that are in Chapel Hill, one thing people, when you're doing research, one thing you would notice about it, when Mr. Benningham, when he wrote those papers and kept documents, you will find nothing reference to disciplining slaves. All that was taken out. I'm just being honest. If you look, there's nothing there talking about the discipline of slaves, but as stories came down, it's there. We know the stories of what happened. You know that they have the big barn that's there, all of that was built by the slaves, different homes. All the homes, if you know, is unusual. They were built, some with wood and some with brick. Most of them was wood, but they built them and they were up off the ground. So none of them was on the ground. And a lot of things, I mean, you had to, and one of the things you have to understand, like I said, not trying to take up a lot of time, but you had to understand, when you're feeding 1,000 people every day, you had to have a lot of resources. And on this plantation, they had those resources, Mr. Cameron, self-sustaining. They made everything. They made, they had their own blacksmiths, they had their own grist mill, their flour mill, they had a railhead, you had carpenters, bricklayers, sawyers, shoemakers, millwrights, carpenters, barrel makers. So all these things, they were self-sustaining. So with that, there's a lot of history that goes into this. And we can go on for days, as Vannessa, Jory, and others we've talked about. There's a lot of information that happened that's at Stagville with time limited that, we can talk about self-sustaining. And to me, I tell people that he was the Bill Gates of the era. Vannessa?
Okay, I'm going to talk a little about as we moved away from Stagville. During the emancipation, almost 3,000 slaves were freed from the Cameron Plantation of Stagville. In their walk down the railroad track into a space of freedom, for the first time, Black men and women and children placed their feet upon freed land, which was called Braggtown. In some maps, it was spelled with 1 G, in others it was spelled with 2. This land, along with so many other Black communities, was built by freed slaves of Stagville. Braggtown was built with strong family connections, along with neighbors that truly looked out for one another. Going to church was also strong connections to the community. This is where a lot of community meetings would take place, along with Bible study and church service. Community meetings were also held in members' homes at that time. Braggtown was and still is a community that knew everyone by name. The names that I call are deeply rooted in Braggtown in many different ways. Families like the Justice, Divine, Camerons, Richmonds, Rileys, Swans, Miles, Holmens, Taylor, Joyner, Harrises, Peaks, Rochelle's, Richardsons, Fearls, Harts, Bryants, Brandons, McNeil, Lee, Tabrons, the Basses, along with the Masons, Jenkins, Dempsons, Turner, Turntines, Hackneys, Martins, Reddishes, Allens, Parishes, Hamiltons, Holloways, Parkers, Evans, and Walkers, and so many other names that I did not mention. There were so many Black families in Braggtown that were homeowners. They took pride in their homes, their lawns, and on Fridays and Saturdays, you would see men cleaning their cars for the weekend to look good and nice for Sundays, to go to church. There were hard-working sharecroppers, factory workers, tobacco workers of the land. Some farmers would take their goods into downtown or near NCCU to sell to make money for their family. I remember when I was a little girl, the streets over where I stay, which is called Dearborn, used to be called Finch Road. I would see a lot of Black men doing railroad track work, construction work, and road work. A lot of the Black women worked as maids and cared for white people's children in places like Hope Valley and Forest Hill, along with other red line areas of Durham. And you have to understand that these people worked hard, but was truly underpaid. I'm going to let Ricky speak a little bit about one of the families that was living in Braggtown.
One of the families that lived in Braggtown was right there at the intersection of Dearborn Drive and Wiley Avenue. And I lived on Wiley Avenue, and that was the Holloways. With the Holloways, that family, they owned land. And I think when I looked at the information on it, that the Holloways, they had about 200 acres of land. And I remember working with Mr. Holloway, not working. I wasn't working with Mr. Holloway. I was a little boy. They were that was my daycare. So my mother would take me up there during the day when she would go to work, and I would be there. There were some unique things about that farm for the Holloways. So on there was Mr. John Holloway, Mahalia, Rosa, and Aura. So they even still had what they called that during those days, a cook shack. I don't know if people know a thing about a cook shack. It was wood, the floor was dirt. They had a huge stove in there where they cooked out of every day. And so when Mr. Holloway and his sons, when they would go into work the fields, Miss Mahalia, Miss Rosa, Miss Aura, one of those, they was cooking the breakfast, and they made this long pan tray of biscuits. And they would set the biscuits out in the window. So when they got ready to go into the field, they would grab them some biscuits and going on to the field. So with that, they had sustainability of the land. They worked the land. They used the mules. They had all of the equipment they needed, and they worked that land. And my thing was, I would be around there. Yes, I would get the water. I would be in the cook shack most of the day. And the privilege of that was what? You get to eat good all day long. So 3 meals a day, and you get to eat good. One of the stories I shared with Vannessa was on the corner of the house near Dearborn Drive was this huge pecan tree. And what I would do, I would go out, gather up the pecans, put them in a bag, and as people would come by sometimes, they would ask me, are you selling the pecans? I would be like, yes, I'm selling the pecans. And so I would sell the pecans for like $1 a bag. And at the end of the day, I might make about $15, $20. And there's one particular day when I went to the porch, and Mr. John was sitting on the porch, and he looked at me and he asked him, he says, where's my cut? I was like, what do you mean your cut? My pecans? My money. So it was one of those things for him with that, I said, well, I only have $20. He was like, my pecans. He said, I tell you what, you take 5, I take 15. What choice did I have? He was right. So, but with the Holloways, that family, from my understanding and looking at it during that time, they had the biggest farm in that area of Braggtown during that time. It was huge. And then from time to time, yes, I would get to go to the field. I would get to ride on the mule while they was in the field, especially during, those plowing months. It was hot. But that family, and if you go out there now, that all that area right there, if you go to Dearborn Drive and Wiley Avenue, and you look on that side where the farm was, you see nothing but houses now. But the most particular thing about it, see what the name of the streets are. And the streets will be Mahalia and Aura. So that tells you they did give them that respectability of naming it and leaving some kind of legacy of remembrance of them. So that's one of the good things about it. I mean, back then, when you knew that Black people did own their land, paid their taxes, did what they needed to do as good citizens of Durham. Back to you, Vannessa.
Thank you, Ricky. I want to speak now on just a few key people that lived in Braggtown. For one, Miss Jessie Fearl. She was a community activist. She worked for the city of Durham for over 30 years with Parks and Recs. She was an activist for human rights. She worked with voter registration and the Housing Authority of Durham. She gave of herself in so many ways. Another person that I think highly of is Miss Pollock. She was the worker of the cafeteria at Lakeview School during segregation. She made sure we ate home-cooked food like fresh peeled white potatoes, cabbage, and homemade Salisbury steak with gravy. Homemade biscuits, and I mean real apple pie made from scratch. Not only did she make sure we ate well, every child was her child, and she would make sure we stayed in line by teaching us respect, to always be honest, and core values, and so many other great things that she taught us. Another wonderful person of our community, Mr. Walter Walker, a resident of Braggtown who donated a house he owned in the community so we could have a second Black library in our community. Excuse me. The first Black library was the Stanford Warren Library on Felver Street. At the time of him donating this library, Blacks were not allowed in white libraries. So he wanted to make sure children in this area would have a library to go to learn to read. Along with telling us, when you read a book can take you anywhere you want to go in the world. Even when there was boundaries set for Black people. Another awesome person that I really admired that was in my life, Miss Clements, was the first Black principal I ever knew or saw at Lakeview School. This is still doing segregation. When we would walk to school, this space was where everyone looked like me. And the teachers taught us about so many things: math, reading, science, history, and to be proud of who we were. I was in a space where I was learning about Black leaders here and around the world. Then desegregation set in, and so many things changed, starting with the having to catch the bus to Braggtown School, where all the Black kids had to sit at the back of the bus, and we were always picked up last, standing in the cold. And when going home, we had to be dropped off last. And it was the longest ride home that I can remember. I'm gonna pass it on to Jory.
So my name is Jory Bryant. I'm a descendant of Stagville, and I was lucky to be a part of a mural project that we worked on. And during that mural project, we gathered many oral histories by partnering with Dr. Johnson and the Braggtown Community Association. I was able to interview a man by the name of Emmanuel Dunnigan, who's the former president of the Braggtown Neighborhood Council. Mr. Dunnigan was born in Lebanon Township, and he was raised by his grandmother, Coral Mason Dunnigan, who is the child of Ephraim Hart, like Ricky spoke about earlier. Ephraim Hart was named after a slaveholder who sold him to the Benningham at the Stagville Plantation. Mr. Dunnigan also worked. His grandfather worked for the Mr. Earl Latta Grading Company, and he also was a world worker, like Vannessa talked about earlier. And he also was a sharecropper in Bahama. Mr. Dunnigan moved to Braggtown in 1964 on Nellywood Street. Back then, Braggtown was rural. The neighborhoods had gardens and chickens, and his stepfather had 3 ponies, Mr. Roman Lewis, who was from Columbus County. Mr. Hodges had hogs, and Mr. Romy also had hogs, and Mrs. Scarlett had hogs. Mr. Dunnigan went to Lakeview School, and the community back then was very safe, and people took care of each other. We also was able to interview a woman by the name of Peggy Linda Burton Best, who moved to Horton Grove when she was 8 years old. And her father and mother's people was enslaved at Stagville, and then her parents sharecropped and League of the Mines owned it, Stagville Plantation. Her father was a tobacco farmer, and her grandmother lived in Belvin Avenue in the community. They went to Mount Level Baptist Church, which came off the plantation, and when her father went to Red Mountain, and her grandparents went to Mill Grove Primitive Baptist Church. We also interviewed Deacon Willie Lee Gray from Lakeview Baptist Church. Gray was born in 1931, and he was raised also by his grandmother, Florence Woodard Gray, who lived in Braggtown. And they moved there in 1938. His aunts brought him and his grandmother from Belhaven, North Carolina in 1936 to Durham, and they lived for a short amount of time over in the Haytop community. And eventually they moved to Braggtown because his new step-grandfather wanted to farm, and they moved on old man's homestead land to farm. His wife, Mildred Parker Gray, was one of the first Black licensed practitioners, nurses at Duke, and started in 1952 and worked there for 42 years. His mother died in World War II, and Doc Belvin, who owned all the land out from Stagville to Roxborough, actually held most of the land that Mr. Gray told us about out in Stagville. And his brother Lee Belvin actually had a house that was now where the Church's Chicken is at on Roxborough Road. Belvin's owned land back all from Braggtown all the way back to what's now Club Boulevard in the Fence Row Road area initially. And we'll speak a little bit more about Belvin in a second. Gray went to Mill Grove Rosenwald School and eventually went to Hillside. And he ran track, and Mr. Curry was his principal. So we also was able to pick up some information about churches. Because many of these individuals, like I said, Mr. Gray was at Lakeview Church, but we also were able to interview Mr. J.W. Freeman, who was at Mount Olive Baptist Church. Now, the interesting thing, Mount Olive Baptist Church was organized in 1891 by Reverend Bill Neal. Before an edifice was erected, early members worshiped under a brush arbor. And 3 young girls, Sister Mary Beasley, Sister Susie Mitchell, and Sister Mariah Reddish, were asked to go into the community to solicit help to build a church. Through God's favor, and 2 acres of land donated for a permanent place by Doc Belvin, they built the place that Mount Olive now stands. Lakeview Baptist Church also was built in 1962. Actually 1966, November 12th. And it was Brother Henry Reddish who originally had the meeting at his home. And at that meeting, representatives of the church formulated plans to start an independent body of worship. And they presented and taking an active part in the planning of Brother Reddish. Benny Holmen, who worked for Nello Tier, was able to procure equipment to actually build the church from Nello Tier. Walter Walker, J.W. Green, Alan Reddish, Abner Mason, and Willie Gray, and George Fuller, Theodore McLaurin, Harvey Parker, Maynard Jones, and Charles Reddish. Also in Sisters Alice Wilson, Mildred Gray, Elizabeth Jones, Edna Mae Reddish, Nora McDuffie, and Annie Gaddis all were a part of starting this church. We interviewed Mr. Freeman, and Mr. Freeman never lived in that community, but he served as a pastor for over 30 years, pushing on 40 now, in that community. And one of the things that I got from his interview that Mr. Freeman's talked is he talked about how the people of the community lean heavily on the songs that they sung, the spirituals that came off the plantations. Those songs helped them get through very difficult times. He said that those were root songs that keep the community together. Another church that we haven't spoken about was New Covenant United Holy Church, which came to the community in 1972. It moved from a dilapidated building on Ringland Street in Hickstown section of Durham, North Carolina, to a new building located in Braggtown on now Newborn Drive Street. And I'm gonna pass it over to Constance.
Hi, I'm Constance Wright, and I'm a lifelong resident of Durham. I'm new to Braggtown as compared to Jory, Ricky, and Vannessa, but I'm going to tell you some of the history about why some of the people in the neighborhood that I grew up in Durham migrated to Braggtown. My family was one of the first residents of the newly built McDougal Terrace housing projects in around 1955, 56. We moved there from Banks Place, which was located in the heart of Hayti, one of the many communities that was destroyed by urban renewal. From McDougal, we moved just off of Glen Street. Glen Street was a thoroughfare through Hayti to East Durham, from Hayti to East Durham. And there were many residents and businesses that lived on Glen Street. Glen Street no longer exists. After several more moves, we settled in the newly built Fayetteville Street projects. The fancy name for it now is Fayette Place. But when we were growing up there, it was Fayetteville Street projects. Ironically, Banks Place was destroyed to build Fayetteville Street projects. And now Fayetteville Street projects no longer exist. Between 1967 and 1971, during the fast tracking of the urban renewal and the building of the East-West Expressway, which was the first name for 147, now it's 147, that went through Durham and straight through the heart of the Black communities, many public housing units were built all around Tent City, which was supposed to be a temporary housing for displaced businesses after they destroyed Hayti, was built. It was on the old Fayetteville Street. Fayetteville Street was remodeled and now it's a 4-lane road, and part of the old Fayetteville Street still remains there. But the only business that's there now is the Carolina Times. Businesses such as Scarborough Hoggett, the Green Candle restaurant, barbershops, and the convenience store was in Tent City, along with many other businesses. Like I say, the Carolina Times still remains there, but many of the businesses, they either relocated after the city failed to rebuild their businesses in Hayti. They either relocated or they completely went out of business. Oxford Manors, which is a public housing, was built in Braggtown community, along with the Bluefield subdivision, now known as the Club Boulevard community. Many of the 4,000 displaced residents relocated to Braggtown. Although McDougal Terrace was not displaced, many of the residents moved to Bluefield with the dream of home ownership, only to find out that those houses did not meet the federal government's criteria for ownership. Thus, the development of the Glenbrook and Kerwood Estate subdivisions were built. The residents of McDougal Terrace were finally able to realize their dream. Other communities moved to Bluefield and to Kerwood also, But because I'm from MacDougall Terrace, those are the people that I'm more familiar with. I moved to Braggtown in 1987, and I bought my home in the newly built Evergreen subdivision, which is right off of Henson Drive. I bought my home here for the most part because many of my neighbors and my friends from MacDougall now lived in Braggtown. Braggtown actually brought me back to my roots by reconnecting with friends and neighbors from my past. So now I will turn it back over to Jory.
So the city of Durham displaced a lot of people with the 147 being built. Many communities and subdivisions, like Constance said, were built to house people who were displaced, but many people never actually saw that. What we ended up seeing was a lot of people moving into public housing. We've interviewed several individuals who come from the Hayti community that actually moved into Oxford Manor. We're building more information around that, but we see a common thread. We see that a lot of people found Braggtown to be a place to come after displacement from other communities. And now, during this time, we see there's an opportunity for more displacement to happen even in Braggtown, one of the last havens in the community. So I'm gonna pass it back over to Constance.
Okay. Yes, there has been a lot of development coming into Braggtown, a lot of new development coming into Braggtown. When I was growing up, we used to come to Braggtown. I think I was like 14 when I first came to Braggtown. I just remember how people were so happy here. I mean, we were happy in MacDougall Terrace also. But as I got older and things started changing, our neighborhoods started disappearing, and the people just ended up scattered all over Durham. We were all over Durham. Cornwallis projects was built. Daymar Court was built. Oxford Manor, of course. Velvet Street project, which was in the heart of Hayti, is no longer there. That's gone. So now people are scattered again. But as far as the living here in Durham, and you know, it's like everything is now migrating out to Braggtown. A lot of things are migrating out to Braggtown, but the upkeep of Braggtown is not being, you know, well, we're is what happened with Hayti. Now I'll just turn it over to Vannessa and let her talk some more about Braggtown.
I would like to say thank you again for listening to our history. There's so much that we could tell you about Braggtown and the people who have lived in Braggtown. Coming from a slave plantation to where we are now, it has not been easy, but we have taken everything that has come our way in stride. And I don't just speak for Braggtown, but I speak for every Black community that has been within Durham. So many have been displaced or lost communities now, but we're hoping that in the future that we can gain some of those communities back and hopefully have affordable housing where some of these people can be in these spaces in Durham. But again, we take this time to thank each and every one of y'all who are on the call and to the city of Durham. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alexis John, and I am the Community Engagement Strategist for District 2, where Braggtown currently lays. And I just want to thank Vannessa and Ricky and Constance and Jory for coming to share this really, really rich history. It's important for us to reach back and know where we come from, just so we can have a better idea of where we're going. And we have a few questions I'd like to bring forth for you. The first question someone had was about the lady pointing to a fingerprint in the brick. So if we could go back to that, and if one of you guys would like to share more information on what that picture is.
So that's a picture of the Holmen House. Those bricks are, in many ways, a relic and it's a story. It's showing that people who actually made those bricks, the enslaved people built their own home, and they were forced to. And you see, that's not just the only one. There's thumbprints in there, and there's a small child's footprint in one of the bricks. On the side, if you ever get a chance to go out there, if you go on the side of that chimney, you'll see a small child's footprint where a child probably was playing while their parents was making bricks for the house.
Awesome. Jory, thank you so much for sharing that. Another question comes in and it says, I've heard that the southern end of Braggtown was renamed Colonial Village about 20 years ago in an attempt to attract more white homeowners and raise property values. Does anyone know anything about why, when, or how Colonial Village was renamed? Is there any discussion of shedding the Colonial Village name?
I've never heard of it.
I mean, I know of Colonial Village, and I do know that it was supposed to have been kind of like what we're going through now, with gentrification, and it started out we like for people to know, no matter what part of Braggtown you're in, whether it be Colonial, whether it be Curwood, Glenbrook, Bluefield, any area of Braggtown, it's Braggtown. We just have a lot of different subdivisions, and we want everybody to know that they're welcome to be in that space, no matter who they are.
Thank you, Vannessa. Another question coming in is about the picture of the fire. Throughout the slides, there is a picture of a building on fire. Can one of you all share more information on what that picture is?
That's the Braggtown School. That's the school. And this is the particular school I was talking about when we were bused to school and having to sit at the back of the bus. This was an all-white school before that actually happened. And this happened years later, where the school was burned down. I was probably, I know I was out of high school at the time we were burning down.
Thank you, Vannessa. We have we have a lot of questions coming in right here. Moving forward, we just wanted to talk a little bit about sharing any great memories that you all have. Vannessa and Constance, I know we have talked a lot, but can you guys share one of your favorite memories that you have of Braggtown?
Well, I can start. The first time I came to Braggtown, I was 14. And I came to Braggtown because I had gotten my first job with the Youth Corps here in Durham. And I always heard about Braggtown, but I always heard that it was the country. Some of my neighbors would go away for the summer. When you would ask them where they were going, they were saying, we're going to the country to stay with our grandparents summer, and Braggtown is where they came to. So I finally got to see where Braggtown was and what Braggtown was all about. I think the name of the street that we were on is I can't remember the name, but it's right beside where it's right beside where the fish place is, coming up that way. And Mill Grove was where we had to pick the kids up from Braggtown. And it was just so interesting, the stories that they would tell us and how much fun they would have playing outside, playing in the dirt. Some of them picked tobacco when they were younger and different things like that. So those stories to me were really, really interesting. And then when, like I say, urban renewal came through and demolished Hayti, and a lot of the people from that area and in McDougal Terrace moved out here. I visited out more, and I don't know, I just like this part of town. So when I got a chance to purchase a house, this is the town that I came to. So my memories of town when I was really, really young, and I came to the country. So that's one of them.
For me, I first have to say I'm a descendant of slaves on both sides of my family. My mother is a descendant of slaves from Granville County, and my father was a descendant of slaves from the Chatham County area, which is Chapel Hill. And the people who actually owned my father's family was the Mason Plantation, which now is called Mason Farm, which is also a part of UNC. But I would have to say, one of my most favorite things is just knowing that even now to this day, a lot of those people that came off that slave plantation, as well as up to now, those names still remain in my community. So I feel my community is so intact with people from my descendants and Jory's and Ricky's descendants, that the land is still rich with history, and that I can still call names and I can still see faces from when I grew up of people who have lived there for years. So that's one of my favorite things about my community. I'll pass it to Jory.
My favorite is sitting with the elders in the community and hearing their stories, and thinking about our ancestors who experienced so much difficulty but found so much joy, and the resiliency to be able to do that, but also like not be in many ways identified as resilient, because to be identified as resilient is to take on the identity of hard times too.
For me, some of the memories I have reference to growing up in Braggtown is on, Saturday mornings. Myself and my cousins, Robert Evans and Roderick Evans, we would get the wagon. We get a little wagon, and we would go from Wiley Avenue. We go all the way down Dearborn to where the creek is. And on both sides of the roads, what we would do is pick up Pepsi and Coke bottles. And from there, we go all the way back down to the Town and Country that's on Club and Dearborn, and we go in there and redeem them. Now, you can get 5 cents on a bottle, and sometimes we have 20, 30 bottles. So what we do is what? We go in and load up on everything, because then it was what? Penny candy. So we load up and we might get about $7. So we go in and we get bags of candy. We get the honey buns, we get the pickle pig feet, we get the sodas, we load up, right? And we would eat candy all day long. So those are some of the things that we would do on Saturday mornings. And as we get our little money for our candy, and then, on other times, again, being 10, 11 years old, we had a big tree which still standing in my parents' yard on Wiley Avenue. And the thing I loved about it, because mostly during the spring and the summer, the neighbors would come around, the men, Mr. James Perry, Mr. Carter Albright, Mr. Joe Elliott, Mr. Burton, and a couple of other the neighbors, Mr. Hicks, they would come around and they sit, they all sit up under the tree and they talk about, what's going on. Not too much on politics, but it's mostly about gardening, hunting, where to go fishing. I don't know if people ever heard of people going gigging. That's when you go at nighttime. And to me, that was a rite of passage because you would have to put on your waders, you have a lantern, and you have your gig. And you go out and you walk in the river, and we go down to the Eno River. You have to know when the river is low. You can't go when it's high. You can't go when the current is strong. And you get, you gig the sucker fish. That's what they were, the way their mouths were. So some of those things, like I said, like Jory was saying, listening to the elders and listening what's going on, what they're going to plant, what they're not going to plant, this, that, and the other. So it's a lot of memories of those kind of things of what we did and how we sufficed and, how we got through different hard times.
Thank you all for sharing those memories. We have a few more questions coming in. I've heard that the freed slaves walked along the railroad tracks when they settled at Braggtown. Do they have any other stories about the railroads that runs through the community? Memories of trains running through?
I can remember the trains coming through in an area where some of the slaves I know probably actually came off. It's property that my family has owned for years. And we have a convenience store in that area. But you can hear the whistles at night, not just in Braggtown, but as the trains was heading into downtown Durham, you could still hear the whistle blowing. And even now, if I listen close, sometimes I can hear the train whistle that far from my house to downtown. There have been accidents with the train hitting cars on the railroad track. One of the things that we used to like to do as children, we used to like to put pennies and quarters and coins on the railroad. So when the train would run over, it would make them flat.
That's right.
So, and we used to walk down the railroad track at night with Huckleberry Finn. And we would go out hunting and we would come back with blackberries from these wild bushes that were just off on the side of the railroad track. So there are a lot of railroad stories I could tell. I've even recently taken a nail from the railroad track in honor of my ancestors that walked that track. So I do have it sitting in my curio at home in my living room. So yes, that railroad track has a lot of memories, fun memories, as well as the ones that make me feel proud to know that they walked that railroad track to their freedom.
Yeah. One of the things that on the railroad tracks, what we used to do in the summer, I mean, when you talk about going to what we used to do in Braggtown, what it was then was Duke Park or Duke Pool. Everybody used to walk to Duke Pool, okay, to go into the pool. But, before that, we walked the railroad tracks down to a part where there was the trestle and under it was the waterway or whatever. And that's where we would go. That's where we would go swim. Like, hey, where y'all going? We going to the trestle. That's what we call it, the trestle. We going to the trestle today, and that's where we would go swim before we was able to go to Duke Pool. And like I said, on the railroad track, I've walked the railroad track all the way from where Vannessa's family store is, all the way out to Hamlet Road. Just to go walking and see what was there, what was going on. And it was a thoroughfare. A lot of people on the railroad track walking, going to wherever they needed to go. Or get on the railroad track instead of getting on the road with the vehicles, get on the railroad track and go visit people, in that area of Braggtown that I went to school with. So hey, like you said, a lot of stories.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I would say there's one other story I would like to tell. My brother and them, they had a house down in the woods off from the railroad track. So this is for those that used to know about the shack. It was a place where they would go party. I know back in the day, y'all probably heard of what the juke joint, the honey hole. Well, my brother and some of his friends, they had this building or old house they called a shack, and they used to go down there and party right off the railroad track.
So yeah, this was historical thing was that Paul Cameron actually was the head of the Department of Transportation, and a lot of enslaved people actually built those tracks that ran from the plantation into the city of Durham through Durham. And the reason why Durham was even incorporated is because they needed to connect Hillsborough to Wilson on the move tobacco back and forth. And so, and a bit of family lore, they say my great grandfather used to catch the train into Durham every day. Who was Willie Holmen, who came out, his father came out the plantation.
Thank you so much for sharing that. As you guys know, we're getting so close to the end, and I'm so sad because I'm enjoying these conversations. We all know that Braggtown has changed significantly over the years. It looks probably completely different now than how it looked back when you guys were growing up. But a lot of folks are asking, with these changes that are coming forth, how can Durham residents support the Braggtown residents in fighting current issues that they are dealing with today?
To me, I think one of the things.
Go ahead, Ricky. No, go ahead, Ricky.
I think one of the things that is going on is the biggest part of gentrification, right? And if people don't understand what gentrification is, it's like, I know Vannessa, they was working on a project or working on this issue with this new developer that's out there off of Old Oxford and I think Hamlet, that area out there where they're putting in, I can't remember how many houses, I don't know, 1,000 houses or something of that nature. We all know, right, what happens in the Braggtown is basically what people are doing now. They're coming in with these black neighborhoods where families or heirs haven't taken care of the property or what they're doing, buying the house at $50,000 or $60,000, tearing it down, and then building a house of $200,000-$300,000, which does what? It increases the property value of the area. And as they do that, increase the property value, then people that live there, when their taxes go up, guess what? They can't afford it. You know, they're pushed out. That's one of the things that, you know, it's happening all over Durham, but still, even in Braggtown, you know, all over Durham, that's the biggest thing of gentrification. It's happening everywhere. That's one of the things I think people need to understand. You know, you can't, I know they say you can't stop progress, but you can show curve it if you do the right thing.
I was going to say also that we do have a petition that's out there if people would like to sign it, and it's about the developments that Ricky was just talking about. We were able to go up against the developers with the city county planners to get a unanimous no vote on the zoning and development at this time. On if you would like to be a part of the call, we would really love for you to be in support of us on November the, I think it's the 16th. We'll be meeting with, on which day?
The 16th, you're right.
Yep, November 16th. We will be meeting with City Council to hope that they will give us a no. Not that we don't want to see development in Braggtown, but there has to be some places and spaces for people to live with affordable housing. In Braggtown, the lowest income level is at $19,000 a year, and the highest is at $32,000. So that puts us in a whole nother bracket compared to other communities. And then you have people that's moving into Durham that are making $10,000, $20,000, and $30,000 more than the residents that were already here.
I think we lost her, but we're gonna go ahead and close up. We are actually right at 1 o'clock. And there were questions about the mural project and things like that. And we will be happy to post that information on our Facebook page, which is Durham Community Engagement. So we'll get that information to you. And please complete our survey. Since you're here, you registered and RSVP'd. So Laura Biediger will be sending out a survey for you to fill out and give us feedback. We're always open for feedback just to improve these stories that we're bringing to you. And if you would also like to learn more about equitable community engagement, please email Laura Biediger, laura.biediger@durhamnc.gov. Vannessa, Ricky, Constance, and Jory, on behalf of our team at Community Engagement, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us and being here to share this rich history of Durham. And I would just
I
like
wanted to say thank you, Alexis, for doing the Q&A. I know that that's really difficult to get questions from all over, and we want to ask lots of things. So thank you for being on. I wanted to promote also really quickly, next month's history session will be on Crest Street. I think that'll actually be today was probably a really good introduction in the discussion around Hayti and the East-West Expressway. Is that the correct title, previous title?
Yeah, that was the original title of it, the East-West Expressway. Yep.
So you can even see that in the signs here, throughout the expressway. So we'll have residents on from Crest Street next month. That's Friday, October 23rd. You can RSVP in the same place that you RSVP'd for Braggtown. That's durhamcommunityengagement.org. And we're still working to schedule our November session. Hope you can join us. And as Alexis was saying, thank you to everyone, and thank you to Alexis and Cheryl and Fallon who helped to make this possible. Also Amber Wade, I don't have her name on here, but thank you for helping us with the Zoom account. We recorded this and we will post it on our website, post the links on our website, as well as links to probably other things like the mural project, and the recording will be on the city's YouTube. So I will stop the recording now. I think I can do that. Maybe not. Okay. There we go. Stopped.